Hello everyone, this is Kassi with LDRS Creative. Today we are going to be painting the beach. Now this is a little bit more of an intermediate painting, but don't let that scare you off. We are going to work through it step by step together. For my paints I have a light brown and a dark brown as well as a light blue and a dark blue. I have a couple different paint brushes and I will be working on some LDRS Creative watercolor paper. I'm going to start by taping this down to a board. This will allow me to use a lot of water without the paper warping. It will also allow me to manipulate the paper without having to actually touch the paper. Make sure you press firmly along the edges of your tape to ensure you don't get any leakage underneath your tape. Now for this beach, I want to have some sand, some foam, and some water, but I don't want them evenly spaced on the paper. So I want to kind of look at where I want each to be. And we're going to start by marking in our sand. So I'm using a very, very light wash of our light brown color. And I'm just trying to figure out where I want my sand. This is just a rough placement. And I'm making sure that the bottom edge of my sand is an uneven, kind of jagged, organic line because that's going to be the top of the foam. So think about what foam bubbles look like. I'm also going to take a little bit of that sand color and bring it down past where I want the foam and into a little bit of the water. I have a foam-shaped kind of dry spot on my paper right now. I'm going to give that a quick dry. Because we did this so light, if we change our minds on where we want things later, it's okay. Now for our water, we're going to start with, again, a very light wash of the water. So we're going to add a lot of water to our light blue color. And I'm looking at where the bottom of that foam edge is. And I'm going to just kind of mark that in. You can see that kind of jagged, foamy edge. And then I'm pulling down the color. Now, as we get further away from the foam, we can start adding more paint to our water to get a darker color. I'm not worrying about getting a flat wash right now. I'm just kind of letting the colors swirl and mix and be a little bit uneven. Deepening the color down at the bottom and making sure that all of that water stays wet. I'm also going to dance my paintbrush along the top edge of that water with just some clean water on my brush and let that blue kind of seep up into that foam a little bit. Now we're just letting the water do the work for us there. And a bit more dark right down at the very bottom. Now while our water is still wet, we're going to take some plastic cling film, the kind that you keep in your kitchen. We're going to scrunch it up, open it back up, make sure there's some wrinkles and crinkles in it, lay that over your water, and then scrunch it into whatever patterns you want. I like to keep these smaller, tighter scrunches up near the top by the beach and some wider, bigger crinkles down further away from the beach. Once you are happy with all of your wrinkles and crinkles, we're going to set it aside to dry. As for how long that will take, it really depends on how much water is on the paper, as well as how much humidity and the temperature of the room that you're in. So it's going to be a little bit of experimentation to figure out the sweet spot for you. Now I pulled mine up a little bit early, so there are some puddles. The longer you leave it on, the drier the paint is, the crisper all those different patterns are going to be. Because I still had some puddles, mine got softened just a little bit, and that's okay. I'm just going to take my heat gun and finish drying them so that we can move on to the next step. For our next step, we're going to take a thicker version of our light blue color and we're going to add that right along the bottom edge of that foam. This is going to create the shadow. Once you have that color in, you're going to want to rinse off your brush, get it nice and wet, and then soften the color by pulling the color down with that water. We're also going to add some layers of color on top of what we've already done. Again, we're working in thin layers, so quite a bit of water. Tipping your board will let the water and the paint run in interesting patterns. I'm using both blues. I am trying to keep my darker colors at the bottom still, and my lighter colors up towards the sand. When you're happy with this layer, go ahead and dry it. You can use your heat gun. You can use a paper towel to dab off any excess puddles. Um, I'm just going to turn my board and let that dry a little bit naturally. And I'm going to use just water on my brush and lightly touching the still damp shadow areas. This will let them bleed into the foam. You can see the color is kind of running. This is letting the water do the painting for you. This will give some really organic and soft colors to create the foam. If you get too much water on there or it starts running too much, you can grab a paper towel and just dab the edge of it. This will help control where your paint is actually going to go. Now, while we have it in this position, we'll go ahead and dry it. We want to make sure that our foam is completely dry before we start working on the sand. And we're going to do with the sand what we did with the water. We're taking a thick mixture of our light brown and painting in the edges of the foam, so the shadows of the foam, and then using some water to pull that color back down. You want the darkest sand color to be right up against where the water is because that's where the sand is wet. And while that dries, we'll go ahead and flip it around again. It's always easier to flip your painting than try and bend yourself into crazy pretzels. So go ahead and flip your painting. We're going to do the same thing on the sand that we did with the water. We're using just water to lightly brush against the still wet sand color and let it bleed down into the foam. I'm also adding just a very thin layer of that light sand color to the upper part of the water where that water is really shallow and you would see the sand underneath it. One of the beauties of watercolor is the transparency, so you can build up layers and still see what's underneath the other layers. Speaking of layers, let's add another layer of blue. I'm not doing any solid washes. I'm just tapping it in kind of random places to create some different shadows and plays with the light. You can always dab away extra color. You can also soften it by adding more water and just letting things blend and move. When you're happy with this layer, go ahead and dry it with your heat gun. At this point, our sand should be dry, so let's turn our board around and do another layer on our sand. We're going to put a paper towel over the water and most of the foam, and we're going to mix up some of that dark brown. And I am just flicking that over the sand. When you look at a sandy beach, it's speckled with all sorts of different colors. So I'm speckling it and then I'm blotting off some of the speckles. And then I will also use some of that light sand color and speckle that. I just want to get a lot of different speckles going on the sand. Then you can soften those speckles out with another thin layer of paint or just water. When you're happy with that, go ahead and flip your board back over to the water side. I'm going to do the same thing with the water that I did with the sand. So I'm going to protect the sand and then flick some paint onto the water. I'm using a bigger brush for this so I'll have bigger speckles. If you want to take it one step further, go ahead and grab some white gouache. White gouache is thicker than watercolor. It's more opaque than watercolor, but it is watercolor adjacent and it is a water-soluble medium. So you can use it with watercolors. I'm just going to flick some of those white speckles over the whole page. It's going to soften down. It's not going to stay super opaque because that's the nature of the gouache. However, it will give some contrast and some interesting texture. At this point, if your paper is dry, you can remove the tape. You want to remove the tape slowly and at an angle so that you don't tear your paper. You can see on my paper how I didn't get the tape pressed down well enough, and there's a lot of leakage that went on around the edges. Now, don't panic if that happens. I'm going to show you how to fix that. This brush is called a stiff scrubber brush. Now, just like the name says, the bristles are nice and stiff. This will allow you to scrub off the excess paint that got where you didn't want it to go. You're going to add just a little bit of water to the bristles and gently scrub over your paper and then blot with a paper towel. Now, this works really well along these edges. It does remove a little bit of the paper. So if you're working in an area where you want to add more paint, you might have some problems. But to clean up the edges, it works fantastically. Now that we have our beach all painted, it's time to turn it into a card. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my Misty, and I'll put my painted panel in the corner and secure it with some magnets. I'm going to be using the LDRS Creative Lighthouse Stamp set to finish my card. I've chosen the Sandy Toes Happy Heart sentiment, and I want to place it down in this bottom corner. I'm just trying to figure out where exactly I want it. Then I'm going to close the Misty. I will make sure it's straight and pick that up. And I'm going to be using some LDRS Creative Watermark ink. Now this is for heat embossing. So while that ink is still wet, I'm going to pour over some white embossing powder. Then I'll put the excess back in the jar and use my heat gun to melt that embossing powder. The white embossing powder is visible against that dark blue background, and it isn't as intense as a black ink would be. Now I'm going to pop this back into my Misty because I want to add some starfish to my beach. I'm just going to figure out how I want to place them. And I want one of my starfish to be going underneath the foam just a little bit. That will help add dimension to my piece. But I want to protect my foam, so I'm going to add just a little bit of torn tape to give it a rough edge right where that starfish leg is going to cross under the foam. For my ink colors, I'm using LDRS Creative Alloy and Iced Tea. These little mini pads are really old. They're back from when the inks were first introduced to the LDRS lineup. They don't sell them anymore, but these colors are the exact same colors that are in the full-size pads. I just didn't have the full-size pads on my desk with me. So what I'm doing is I'm inking up the starfish with some alloy, and then I'm tapping in a little bit of iced tea in various places. This will give a variegated stamped look. Now I want to go ahead and do that again to make it a little bit darker. I don't want the starfish to be too obvious, but I do want the lines to show up. I want to keep the starfish fairly subtle, so I'm using a gray watercolor to paint them in. But then that ended up being a little bit too subtle, so I'm also going to add in just a little bit of peach to the starfish. In the beaches by my house, the starfish are either purple or orange, so I figured that peach would be a subtle way to add a pop of color in there without being too distracting. But I'm still keeping the colors nice and light. I'm loving where we're at so far, but I want to add one more little touch to this before we add it to our card base. So I'm going to bring my paints back in, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of a dark sand color. So I'm mixing my dark brown and my light brown together, and I'm just going to pop in a little bit of a shadow beneath the starfish. This will add that extra little dimension that will give it that realistic look. At this point, we're just going to adhere our card panel onto a top folding A2 card, and our card is done. I hope this made watercoloring just a little bit less intimidating for you. If you give it a try, please share with us the LDRS Facebook group and tag us on Instagram if you share there. I would love to see your work. If you have any watercolor questions or requests, go ahead and leave a comment below so that we know what you want to see. I hope you have a wonderfully creative day and a fabulous summer, and I'll see you soon.